everybody. It's Dr. Gilchrist. Obviously, class has been canceled due to ice, and I actually braved my way out to campus today in my sneakers, and I have to say that might have been a little bit of a mistake. I had a couple of times where I hit the ice and I just went blah. My sneakers don't exactly have the best tread, it's kind of clear. But I am here. I wanted to record this for you, and under normal circumstances, if this were a week or two ago, I probably wouldn't have bothered, but we do have our very first exam coming out on not this coming Friday, but next Friday, February 2nd. So I want to feel like you're prepared, and I want to give you as much opportunity to look through these things as possible, because on Friday, I will be handing out take-home essays and a study guide. I'm going to spend a little part of this afternoon starting to write your exam so that I can give you everything you need by this Friday. Since we didn't have class today, you technically do have a quiz due today at 5 o'clock. However, I am taking late assignments until Wednesday at 5, and I will remind you on Wednesday as well. So hopefully this shouldn't take more than 30 minutes of your time, so feel free to break it up. If you need to speed me up, that is okay too. I think I work best at a minute or 1.25 times speed. But we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit more about neuroanatomy and the different divisions of the nervous system. So where we left off last time were the different divisions of the central nervous system. And you can see a chart that has these different divisions here for us. So we can break the nervous system down into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. You tell the difference between the two because the central nervous system is protected by bones, the brain is protected by the bones of the skull, and the spinal cord is protected by the vertebrae of the spinal column. Then we have our peripheral nervous system, which is made up of the nerves that branch off from the brain and the spinal cords. That would include our 12 cranial nerves, and it would also include the nerves that branch off from the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system can be broken down into two additional nervous systems: the somatic nervous system, which is sometimes also known as the skeletal nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system can further be broken down into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And we're going to talk about all of these divisions a little bit more today. So the somatic nervous system, or the skeletal nervous system, is critical for things like muscle movement and sensory sensation, particularly from the skin. So any sort of voluntary movement or sensation that we get on our skin, whether that is temperature, pressure, etc., is under the purview of the somatic nervous system, and generally we're going to have conscious awareness of these things. It's not like I'm looking off to the side not paying attention to anything and my hand is writing on the blackboard without my awareness. Then we have the autonomic nervous system. And another way to think about the autonomic nervous system is to think of the word automatic. This system is critical for homeostasis of our body. So it's basically making sure that we are alive and kept in balance. So we're not too hot, we're not too cold, we're not too hungry, we're not too thirsty, we're still breathing. This is in control of our breathing, it's in control of our heart rate, our digestion, and we generally don't have to think about these things. Can we control our breathing? Yes, but for the most part, this is not something that we consciously choose to do. We can then divide this into our sympathetic nervous system, which we'll talk more about today, which is to give our body the energy that it needs to deal with stressors or different types of challenges, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is critical for returning us to that homeostatic state where we can be relaxed. And we'll talk more about its actions as well. But as you can kind of see here, I've circled this because I do want to spend a little bit more time talking about the spinal cord. We've talked about some of the major divisions of the brain, but now we're going to talk about the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is the second part of our central nervous system. Our spinal cord is a long bundle of tracts. Remember that we're in the nervous system, we're in the central nervous system, so bundles of axons are going to be tracts. If we're in the peripheral nervous system, hopefully you remember that they're called nerves. This extends from the brainstem and the medulla to our middle back. These contain different types of fibers. So we have what are called afferent fibers that are going to send information to the brain. So afferent means towards the brain. That's going to be our sensory fibers. They take information from our skin and send that information to the brain. We also have efferent fibers in the spinal cord. Efferent means they exit the brain or they come from the brain. These are going to be our motor fibers. So the motor cortex makes contact with these efferent fibers, and that allows us to move our body in various different ways. Now, I will mention that some spinal cord activities do occur independently of the brain. Something we'll talk about more is that for a lot of different motor movements, you do actually need an intact motor cortex to be able to do them. For certain types of reflexes, though, that is not always the case. So for example, I'm going to kind of go down here so you can see in the web, or you can see in the little window. I'm going to go ahead and just very briefly do a patellar tendon stretch reflex. So I'm going to let my leg dangle a little bit. And so what you find is that if you apply a little bit of heavy pressure to your kneecap, an area called the patella, there's going to be a stretch reflex in that muscle, and your leg's going to jerk a little bit. You do not need an intact motor cortex for that to happen. And you don't necessarily, so this can occur independently of the brain. This is a stretch reflex that is entirely in the same section of spinal cord, and it does not necessarily need contact with the brain to be able to do that. So just a quick reminder, I mentioned that the spinal cord are made up of tracts. Remember that when we are in the central nervous system, groups of axons will be called tracts. In the peripheral nervous system, they're called nerves. This is going to become really important when we talk about the spinal nerves. In the central nervous system, groups of cell bodies ideally should be known as nuclei, looking at you, basal ganglia. And then in the peripheral nervous system, groups of cell bodies are going to be known singularly as a ganglion, plural as ganglia. In the central nervous system, plural is nuclei, singular is nucleus. So let's talk a little bit more about the spinal cord. So I kind of mentioned this on Friday that cell bodies account for gray matter, and myelin, particularly myelinated axons, account for white matter. And I mentioned that in the brain, the gray matter tends to be on the outside, and the white matter tends to be on the inside. Now, because the spinal cord is made up of axons, hopefully it's not that surprising to you that the white matter should be on the outside and the gray matter is going to be on the inside. So you can see here in this cross section of spinal cord, the white matter is here, the gray matter is located on the interior. Like the central nervous system, we do have protection from bone, and we have our three meninges here. So we have our dura mater on the outside. We're going to have our arachnoid membrane and our subarachnoid space, and then we're going to have the pia mater right here on the interior. So we have our three meninges like with the brain, and one of the things that you're going to notice here is that we have separate areas for sensory and motor regions. So right here, you're looking at a dorsal root. So remember that based on our understanding of neuroanatomy with the spinal cord, that's going to be the side that faces the back. Here we have our ventral roots, which are going to face the stomach. The dorsal roots are going to be sensory, so they're separated, and then the ventral roots near the stomach will be for our motor processing. So the roots contain all of the axons that supply the muscles, the skin, and the organs. As I've mentioned, the dorsal roots will be sensory, the ventral roots will be motor. But I will mention that once these roots exit the spinal cord, they are going to fuse together to form spinal nerves, part of the peripheral nervous system. So in the spinal cord, motor and sensory information is integrated. Once we get to the peripheral nervous system and we're dealing with the spinal nerves, those nerves are going to be mixed. Now, a critical question comes up. What happens if the spinal cord is damaged? We know that spinal cord damage can lead to things like paraplegia or quadriplegia, and generally what we are going to find is that the severity of spinal cord damage is ultimately dependent on where in the spinal cord that damage is. In general, the higher up that damage is, the worse it is going to be, because, for example, lower regions of our spinal cord are largely going to be related to things like sensory and motor things related to the legs and feet. As we move higher up the spinal cord towards the neck and areas like the cervical spine around the shoulders, those are going to have purview under more and more of the body. So the higher up you go, the more of your body is going to be affected. So generally, higher up tends to be worse than lower spinal cord damage because more of the body is responsible. Now, there are two different types of injury. We can have what is called an incomplete injury or a complete injury. So an incomplete injury could be ipsilateral. It's only damaging one side of the spinal cord, or it's only damaging the sensory side, only the dorsal roots are damaged. So an example of these might be something like syphilis. Now, syphilis can be treated with antibiotics like penicillin. However, if left untreated, syphilis can lead to some problems. We'll talk about some different ways that syphilis damages the brain after spring break. But for now, what we know with syphilis damaging the spinal cord is that it damages the dorsal side of the spinal cord. And depending on the side of that damage, you're going to lose sensation on that corresponding side of the body. Another example is Brown-Séquard syndrome. This is a case where you lose some motor and sensory function on the same side as the damage, so it's ipsilateral damage. Now, the other major type of injury is a complete injury. This will usually happen because of things like blunt force trauma or major injuries, car accidents, things like that. And in these cases, this is going to involve both sensory and motor, and it's going to involve both sides of the spinal cord. Now, a little bit more, we're going to move on to talk about the peripheral nervous system. So in general, the peripheral nervous system is going to be made up of the spinal and the cranial nerves that extend from the spinal cord and the brain. And this peripheral system not only provides energy and information to muscles and our sensory organs, as in the somatic nervous system, it also provides information to glands and our internal organs through the work of the autonomic nervous system, which can then be divided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So let's go ahead and talk about those a little bit now. So first of all, I want to talk about, I want to talk a little bit about our peripheral nervous system and our spinal nerves. And here you can actually see them. We have 31 different pairs. So we have one on the right side and one on the left side of the spinal cord. As I've mentioned, while in the spinal cord, sensory and motor information is segregated in the spinal cord, by the time that they leave the roots of the spinal cord and form the spinal nerves, they have become mixed. So they provide sensory and motor information to the body. So they typically are given letter number names. So we have 4 different letters that we can provide. So right around the neck is where the cervical nerves are. So we have C1 all the way to C8. So these nerves are going to be responsible for things like the head and the neck, the diaphragm, which helps you breathe, the deltoids, the biceps, areas like the shoulders and such, the wrist extenders, the triceps, and the hand. Then just below that, we have our thoracic nerves. We go from T1 to T12. That's going to control a lot of movement for the chest muscles and the abs. The lumbar nerves are next. We only have about 5 of those. Those are for the leg muscles. So you can see why I mentioned that that the axons that basically provide information to the legs and feet are going to be some of the longest in the body because they're controlled by the lumbar nerves, and they have a long way to travel to reach the legs and feet. Then we have the sacral nerves at the very end of our spinal vertebrae, ending kind of around the tailbone. These are going to be critical for bowel movements, bladder movements, and for various sexual functions. Here's what they kind of look like. So here you can actually see the spinal cord and the different nerves. As I've mentioned, here's our lumbar spine. Take a look at how long some of these nerves are that are heading to the legs and the feet. This is why stubbing your toe sometimes takes a while to realize. Here, you can actually see the spinal cord here kind of looks a little bit like some horrifying spaghetti. And then we have our different meninges. In particular, here is our dura. You can see it all kind of wrapped up there. Now, we also have 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and if you have me for sensation and perception, these 12 cranial nerves are probably going to be a lot more important to you because we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about our sensory organs, like our eyes and our ears and things like that. The cranial nerves, we have 12 pairs, 1 on each side once again. Some of these nerves are purely sensory, such as the optic nerve, which we'll talk about after the first exam. Some of these are purely motor, such as ones like the ocular motor nerve, the trochlear nerve, or the abducens. And some of these are going to be mixed, like the trigeminal nerve and the facial nerve. So some of these are purely sensory, some of these are purely motor, and some of these are mixed. Some of these are going to supply the somatic system, like the optic nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve, which includes the auditory nerve, and some of these are going to supply the parasympathetic nervous system, such as cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve, which is responsible for a lot of different organs in the body. Now, compared to the spinal cord, where we have letter number names to help alert us to location, cranial nerves tend to have numeric and functional names. So for example, cranial nerve number 1 is olfactory, cranial nerve number 2 is optic. Now I showed the sensation and perception students a fun little mnemonic to remember the function, or to remember the names of these 12 nerves, and I will share it with you. You will not be tested on the names of these nerves. This is not that type of class, but it's on old Olympus towering tops, a fat Viking guy then snowy hops. So olfactory, optic, ocular motor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, spinal accessory, and hypoglossal. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the autonomic nervous system. Now, whereas the somatic nervous system is largely voluntary and you're conscious of it, so for example, if I want to roll my eyes, I can use my ocular motor nerve to do that, and I'm generally aware that I'm rolling my eyes. The actions of the autonomic nervous system are largely involuntary, and they're out of our conscious awareness. This is going to be kind of surprising as we move on, but both the sympathetic and the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems, both of these branches supply the same organs of the body. So for example, the sympathetic nervous system will have outputs to help increase heart rate. The parasympathetic will have different outputs to decrease heart rate, but they're going to supply the same organs of the body, and they're going to have opposing actions to each other. So the goal of the sympathetic nervous system is arousal. It is designed to basically use energy to give to your body so that you can fight or flee something that is stressful or challenging. The parasympathetic nervous system is largely going to be vegetative. It's designed to help you relax and increase your energy after the sympathetic nervous system has done its job. So sometimes, whereas the sympathetic nervous system is called the fight or flight system, the parasympathetic nervous system is called the rest and digest system. And what we're going to see is that these two nervous systems act in opposition to each other. They naturally oppose each other. So I want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to try to move my head over here. I want to talk a little bit about a couple of different things that you'll need to know about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So basically, nerve impulses for both of these systems are going to begin in motor neurons, either in the brain. For example, some of the cranial nerves like the ocular motor or the facial nerve or the vagus nerve, or they're going to be connecting in the spinal cord, such as the thoracic nerves, for example. They're going to connect with a motor neuron, and then they're going to send that information to glands and smooth muscles that are organs used, the muscles like the muscles of our heart or the intestines or things like that. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is that we have some interesting differences between these two systems. So in the sympathetic nervous system, those nerve impulses are going to begin in the spinal cord, and notice that they're almost entirely restricted to the thoracic and the lumbar nerves. So those are the two sections of spinal cord that largely control the sympathetic nervous system. They are going to send outputs to these other motor neurons that are called ganglia. So notice that we have some additional ganglia. So these spinal nerves are going to make contact with the motor nerves here in these ganglia. So notice some of them are pretty close to the organs. Some of them are pretty far. And these ganglia are going to be near the spinal cord. So for example, this area in the thoracic spine makes contact with the ganglia. It's going to inhibit digestion. It's going to send output to the pancreas, and it's going to stimulate glucose release from the liver and gallbladder. Now notice on the other hand, the sympathetic nervous system, first of all, these nerve outputs either are occurring in the cranial nerves, as you can see here, or in the sacral spine. So notice that both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve fibers, they're completely separate from each other in the spinal cord. But notice their ganglia are kind of closer to the target organs. So here, for example, the vagus nerve has an output right here, which is then going to constrict airway to the lungs. Notice that we don't really have these second motor neurons near the spinal cord. They're much closer to the target organs. So here, the vagus nerve makes contact with a motor neuron here, which slows down heartbeat. Notice that these preganglionic fibers, the fibers that originate in the spinal cord and the cranial nerves, are kept completely separate from each other. Despite all that, notice that both of these systems are contacting all the same organs. So now let's talk a little bit about the opposing effects that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems have on each other. So the sympathetic nervous system will cause the pupils to dilate. Salivation will decrease because salivation is a form of digestion. It is part of our digestive system. It will be inhibited. Skin perspiration will increase. Respiration will increase so that oxygen can get into the blood, and into this oxygenated blood can reach our muscles and things like that. Our heart rate is going to accelerate, digestion is going to be inhibited, and your adrenal glands are going to secrete stress hormones like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. Now notice that the parasympathetic nervous system does the exact opposite of this. So whereas with the sympathetic nervous system, the pupils dilate, they contract. With the parasympathetic, salivation will increase because digestion is being stimulated. Perspiration will dry from the skin. Respiration will slow. The heart rate will slow. Digestion will activate, and the adrenal glands will basically decrease their secretion of those stress hormones. And you can see some of these other opposing effects here in this previous figure. So, for example, the sympathetic nervous system will stimulate glucose release. It's a major source of energy in our body. The parasympathetic system will stimulate the gallbladder to basically metabolize that glucose. So you can see some different things that are happening here. Now I want to move on with the 5 minutes that we have left to talk about neurons and glial cells. And I've already talked about this a little bit on Friday, but I want to go into more detail about them. So our neurons are basic functional units of our nervous system. And as we've talked about before, the job of glial cells, and remember that we have about 10 times more glial cells than we have neurons, the basic function of glial cells is to provide support to the neurons in the nervous system in a variety of different ways. So let's move on to talk about some of the parts of our neuron. So I'm going to demonstrate on this plushie. So at the very front, right here where the eyes are, your neurons do not have eyes, so I'll just kind of demonstrate right here. What you will see is we have a cell body or a soma. The job of the soma or cell body is to provide metabolic machinery for the cell. So it has a nucleus with chromosomes and DNA. It has all of the other metabolic things that you would need for an animal cell. So it has a mitochondria, it has endoplasmic reticula, it has lysosomes, vacuoles, etc. So it has everything that is needed to keep the neuron running. The other thing that it will have that is very important for a neuron is that it also contains enzymes that are important for the production of neurotransmitters. And we'll start talking more about neurotransmitters this week and next. The dendrites branch out from the neuron cell body like trees. The job of dendrites is to receive input from other neurons. So you can see an example right here where the dendrites of one neuron is making contact with the axon of another neuron. This is a case of an axodendritic synapse. So it's connecting from the axon of one to the dendrites of another. You can also see that we have an axon. The axon is going to be really critical for signal transmission. And as you can see, these particular axons contain myelin. Myelin is going to be really important for speeding up a neural impulse. And we'll talk a little bit more about how this happens soon. And then finally, you can see right here, we have a synapse. This is a junction where neurons connect. Now I'm using the word connect very loosely. It's very hard to see in this figure. Although the neurons are quite close to each other, remember there is a small gap between them. Neurons do not actually touch each other. Now let's talk a little bit about that information flow, where information goes. So here we've kind of done this in a different sort of way. So you can see the axons from other neurons making synapses with the dendrites of another neuron. It is the job of the dendrite to collect information. And we're going to call this a postsynaptic cell. So the information, the sending neuron is what we would call presynaptic. The receiving neuron is what we would call postsynaptic. So information is going to enter the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. And this are from the postsynaptic dendrites. And this is going to come from the axons of the presynaptic neuron. Now, one of the things that I want to show you in this figure is that we have a lot of different connections going on here. We have a lot of different axons that are making contact with the dendrites of this postsynaptic cell. So there can be a lot of different connections between presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons. This information will be collected at the dendrites, will be processed in the cell body, then passed on to the axon to the end feet, where it's passed on to a target neuron's dendrites. Now, one thing that I really want to impress upon you is that this flow of information is unidirectional. This signal does not backpropagate, it does not go in two directions, and it does not move backwards. It only moves in a unidirectional way from the dendrites to the cell body, down the axon to another neuron. It does not travel backwards. So we're going to go ahead and stop here. We'll talk a little bit about some of the different classifications of neurons and glial cells next time. So I'll see you all on Wednesday.